discussing communication in the online course, and we have Audra Andrum here with us. She's one of our stellar instructional designers at OII, and she's prepared a presentation for you all, so enjoy. I'm guessing she'll talk about this, but feel free to use the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on it. And here we go.
Thank you for the introduction, Jody, and thanks everyone for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And so you should be looking at a PowerPoint title slide that says communicating with students in remote environments. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. So before I jump right in, I wanted to say that there's really no perfect way of developing a communication strategy to work with your students this semester. And so as I run through some of these options with you, I'd invite you to consider what's going to work for you specifically and work for your students, because you know them better than I do, and then anyone else knows them. In general, I like to think about communication in remote teaching in terms of lines of communication. And you can use one or a combination of all of these. Actually, you're definitely going to use at least more than one, because you have to have a syllabus, for example. But there are opportunities for you to customize the communication experience to meet the needs of online teaching or remote teaching, because it will be probably in higher volume than what you're currently doing in your face-to-face courses. And getting organized in advance can really help you as far as classroom management goes throughout the term. And so I'm going to talk briefly about some of my favorite tools and entry points into communicating with students when I teach online, and those that I recommend frequently. And that's going to include the announcements tool that's built into Blackboard, your syllabus and other course documents that contain course information, email, that's a big one, using Microsoft Teams like what we're doing today, but also other tools that are similar to Teams. And then just feedback in general as a mechanism for communicating with students individually. And so I'm going to get started with the easiest one and my favorite one, and that's the Blackboard announcements tool. And I do recommend that you send an announcement using the announcements tool at the very beginning of your course to invite students into your course. And you can do that by hitting the Create Announcement button at the very top of your announcements page in Blackboard. And if you haven't logged into Blackboard yet this semester, you should notice a change, and that is that the announcements tool is now the landing page for your Blackboard courses. So unless you choose to use a different page, when you and your students log into your course for fall, you will be directly on that announcements page. And you'll want to send a welcome announcement once you launch your course. It could contain many things, a personal note from you. It could also contain details about the actual course format, whether you're going fully online, whether you are part of that phase 2 hybrid, whether you're teaching a 14-week course or an 8-week course or a 5-week course as appropriate. And also some instructions on how to get into the course and how to get started. And it also may be important for you to include a deadline for doing so. And this could be important because I think that students, like many people, sometimes will make assumptions about what an online course is or what it should look like. And they may assume that because in the past, they've had courses where they could wait the whole week before they logged in, that they may assume that that is okay in your course, and it might be okay. But maybe you want students to complete a syllabus agreement, for example, by Wednesday of the first week of the term. And so you might want to include that information. I actually have a sample announcement that I believe Meg and Jody will be sharing with you. But I think I would like to pull it up if that's okay. So I'm going to switch my screen sharing if you don't mind. Just bear with me for 1 second. You should be looking at a PDF that I have pulled up. Is that correct?
We can see it.
Okay, great. I'll try to make it a little bit bigger. If I can figure out how to zoom in. There we go. And I'm just going to walk through the anatomy of what a sample welcome announcement might look like for those of you who are brand new to teaching online. And this is a welcome announcement that I actually use when I teach online, and I of course adapt it every semester depending on what kinds of students that I have or what kind of course that I'm teaching. The first thing I want to point out is that I do have a statement that says you're receiving this message because you're enrolled in a fully online 8-week section of whatever course it is. I think that this is important because in the past I've had students who may have been confused about what exactly was going on in the courses that they registered for. Because sometimes, you know, faculty advisors, for example, could register students. And this is just always really helpful so that students know what they're supposed to do and know immediately whether they understand the format of the course. Including the course official start date is also helpful. Sometimes we make assumptions again about what students understand about the terms, and this semester is going to be strange for many students because they're going to be receiving so many pieces of communication from administration, from the university, from you, from their other instructors. It's kind of nice to just be explicit about that. It's nice to include a link to the university's learning management system and let students know that they can log in with their Ohio University credentials, and then maybe a note about what they can do to get started. And this would be a good place to put a deadline on this activity if indeed you do need students to log in at by a certain time during week 1 or even during week 2 or something like that. This is going to be especially helpful if you're teaching freshmen or if you're teaching a brand new cohort of graduate students, for example, because they may not necessarily be familiar with the difference between a PID or their Ohio ID or even just what our learning management system is. And so some of the other things that I include, perhaps a note about me, just some basic expectations, a note on email etiquette, which I'll go into in a little bit. So these are some of the things that I have learned to include each semester when I make that first point of contact with my students, just to get everybody off on the right foot, including myself. And I'm switching back to my PowerPoint slideshow right now.
We can see it.
Great. And so in general, I think that if you're going to use Blackboard announcements tool with other tools, that you might want to consider reserving the announcements tool as your official channel. So anything that is officially related to the management of your course, including I like to say anything boring, really, because there are some more fun platforms that we'll discuss a little bit later. Maybe things related to due dates changing or assignment requirements, anything that you would want students to see the moment that they log into Blackboard, because again, that will be their landing page. So it's a really nice feature to leverage about this particular tool in Blackboard. And you can also schedule announcements to go out in advance. So you could even front load your entire course with weekly announcements if you felt like it. And that can be helpful, and I've seen that done really successfully in online courses to make sure that students are crystal clear about what the deliverables are for a certain week or modules or units or however your course is organized. The next line of communication that I'm going to discuss is your syllabus and your course documents. And I believe you attended a session this morning on language that is good to put into the syllabus. And those items are really important, and they do need to go into the syllabus and they need to be a part of it. But there are certain things that I think we put into our syllabi right now because we are teaching face-to-face courses that actually can be unloaded from your syllabus and placed in different parts of your course, because now you have all this extra real estate if you're going to be teaching in Blackboard. And I'll give a few specific examples, but before I move on, I did just want to encourage everybody to comb through their syllabus and their course documents carefully and scrub for any references that may not be relevant this semester. We know that, that not all students understand that things are just going to be different this term, and that you'll be teaching in a different modality. And so removing references to Tupper Hall or to any places that students used to meet to do things can be really helpful. And also it gives the course more of a fresh and customized feeling for students, which we know that they appreciate, maybe not as much as they should, but they certainly do. And on that note, so I mentioned that there are some things that may not belong in your syllabus this semester if you are teaching online. One is the just any kind of assignment descriptions that you typically put into your syllabi. Because remember, you used to have to get this information out to students at the beginning of the term, and you only had one shot in a paper copy. But now you can actually move this information into a particular module folder so that students have this information when they're working on assignments, and they won't have to go back and open up your syllabus each time, or even download the syllabus if you are still uploading a Word document version of your syllabus, which I'm not sure I would recommend, just because of the way that browsers work and the way that students have to download things. I am going to pause for a moment because we have a question in the chat. Doesn't Blackboard generate reminders for due dates if students have notification turned on? If you are using the Blackboard due dates tools, not all instructors do, but yes. And I believe with the new Ultra View that is supposed to be rolled out in the next couple of weeks, that you'll actually be able to add events to your course calendar a little more easily than you could in the past. So that might be something that you want to explore, Julie. Oh, sure. Yeah. Another element that may have been a part of your syllabus in the past, but it could be something that you might want to consider unloading if you're teaching remotely this term, is your course schedule. So I've seen it both ways. I've seen the course schedule built into syllabi, but I've also seen the course schedule existing as a separate document. And I prefer the separate document format when I'm teaching a fully remote course, simply because I do think that it is a separate entity in and of itself that students are going to reference when they aren't referencing a syllabus. And one thing that I did want to highlight about this course schedule in particular that I think is important is that the instructor is using crystal clear naming conventions for assignments. So you'll see that there is Module 2 certification process. The assignments or the deliverables that are due during that module are all labeled M2, and they have names like exercise problems, project, discussion. I think sometimes when we're teaching face-to-face, we can get away more with calling assignments by different names. We might say your summary analysis, or writing assignment 2, or article critique, and they could be all the same assignment. But in an online course, sometimes it's a bit more difficult to maintain that. And so coming up with really good naming conventions can be helpful for your students. Bonus points if you come up with a checklist or something like that, but that's not necessary. I'm going to move on to email. Email is one of my favorite topics to discuss, because even though we all email with our students already, I do think that you'll find an increase in the number of emails you're exchanging with students as you manage your fully online courses this semester. And so sometimes setting up some guidelines in advance can be really helpful. One thing that I strongly recommend is that you recommend to your students that they always use their Ohio email to communicate with you, because it is an official channel of communication, and it's one way that you can be more certain that you are communicating with the correct students about their work and about their particular courses. And also because I know that especially students who are new to Ohio University, I know this because it was true in my case. We don't always know that we have access to these systems, and hopefully that's a much better process. But students are so overloaded when they first join the university with all the new systems that they need to be able to get into, and forms that they need to fill out, and checklists that they need to download. And so just a reminder that they do have access to Ohio University email, and that you would prefer that they use it can be really helpful. Also, you may want to have some sort of email policies in place. I call these policies, you might also think of them as email etiquette or just recommendations. I try to avoid terms like that because sometimes students don't always respond to them the way that I want to, but I do recommend taking one of two approaches if this is a concern that you think you might have in the future. And it is to either customize your own policy, or to send this, to click on this lovely link from Inside Higher Ed and send this to your students in advance. So I'll talk about my own email policy, and I believe that Meg and Jody have a copy of this as well. And I'm not going to share with you while I'm presenting, but you'll have access to this document. A few of the points that I have included in my own email policy were all born out of issues that I needed to resolve with students and not anticipated issues. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, I learned my lesson, I added a policy. I don't use all of these policies each time that I teach. It often depends, again, on my students, but I'll run through the gist of these. For example, I do require that students include our call course numbers and letters in the subject of their emails to me if I'm teaching more than one course in a semester. I found that it's very helpful because then I don't have to take the time to figure out which course a student is enrolled in, because unfortunately it's not always clear from the body of their email what they're asking about. I do ask that students begin emails with some kind of salutation to me. I'm not really hung up on titles or anything, just because I'm not, but it's a polite courtesy to have a salutation. I do feel that emails are still a very formal mode of communication, and probably even more formal now that we have so many more informal modes of communication available to us. But it serves a practical purpose too. I do sometimes get emails from students who think that they're emailing a different professor. So it's important for me to know that the email is for me. Another thing that I request that students do in advance is that if a student is emailing me to tell me that they've had trouble submitting or uploading an assignment, or if they've experienced any kind of technical issues in Blackboard that they need to report to me because it's interfering with them doing their work, that I ask that they also attach the work that they owe me to the same email. You would think that that's something that a student would always do, but sometimes that part's not always clear. Oh, Jody just uploaded the sample policies. Jody, if you think it would be easier, I can switch over and start sharing that document as well.
Either way, I guess if you and the group would want to rather see that, just let us know in the chat. Otherwise, you can pop it open and follow along while Audra presents.
I'll just go ahead and share it. I have it pulled up. So the document that Jody uploaded in the chat for you, it just contains some sample language that I've built over the years. And I'm on item number 5 right now. This one is interesting to me because, and I don't want to put a bad taste in your mouth before you've taken your first bite, but sometimes students, because they do get anxious and because things happen, they wonder if blaming the technology might be a helpful way of getting them through a deadline or getting them an extension. I'm not saying that your students are going to do this. I certainly hope that they don't, but it can be helpful to have just a note about what to do in case somebody does encounter technology issues. And also because they really do happen sometimes. Sometimes students really do have issues with the technology, and having a clear documentation strategy can be helpful. So what I do recommend is that students learn how to do a screenshot, and that they send a screenshot of the error that they receive when they are trying to upload something. And I might even go as far as to ask them to report the error to OIT, just to kind of bring the entire problem full circle, because I do think that OIT should know when students have issues so that they can come up with support systems to help students. Another email policy that I have is to ask students to please not reply to my class announcements from Blackboard and instead create a fresh email. Because sometimes I miss those, especially when a bunch of students reply to my announcements all at once. And then I also encourage students to create solutions that will work for them. So if they're emailing me to let me know that they're having a problem, I like it when they also try to offer me a solution. And I think that that's a really powerful strategy for online learning in particular, where we do spend a lot of time writing to each other instead of talking to each other personally. So again, you're welcome to adapt any of these policies or throw them out completely and not use them, or even refer students to the Inside Higher Ed article that I mentioned, because sometimes, honestly, I just do that instead. And that's linked right here too. Sometimes I'll just send students this article because it's nice if they're hearing it from someone who isn't me, especially if I'm working with students that I really don't anticipate any problems with anyway. So let me get back to my slideshow here, and I do apologize. I've got lots of windows open. I'm going to talk a little bit about Microsoft Teams as well, but I do want to point out that there are alternatives to Microsoft Teams. Teams just happens to be the robust computer-mediated communication tool that our university supports. But you may also be already using a tool that you really like GroupMe, for example, or Slack. And if that's the case, then I'm certainly not suggesting that you need to use Microsoft Teams to communicate with your students in addition to Blackboard. That is not what makes a good online course or a good layered course, but it is something that can enhance or augment the other tools that you're using to communicate with your students if you're comfortable doing so and if you have a purpose for doing so. What I will say is that tools like Microsoft Teams and creating a team is a really good opportunity to create a space for your students to communicate with each other. Because the idea is that we do want students to communicate with each other to some capacity, and that may be more or less important for your courses in fall, depending on what you're teaching. And the advantage of creating that space is that you are setting up your students to communicate with each other in a way that is visible to you as the instructor. Because you may require students to communicate with each other and have them come up with their own solutions, and that also is fine. And they may be using GroupMe or Facebook tools or whatever they want to do. But when you create a space in Teams and perhaps you create a team, then students can communicate with each other in a way that you can see a little bit more clearly. And an essential part of this being successful is early instructor buy-in. So if you're going to use Teams or if you're going to use one of these tools, it is very helpful that you maybe do a little learner training in the beginning to show that you're also going to be working in this space frequently and that it is an opportunity for them to communicate with you. I mentioned earlier that anything boring might be best sent through the announcements tool. Anything that isn't boring can probably go into Teams. So it is a great space for you to upload anything interesting, relevant that you find that may not have been part of your core curriculum, but is something that certainly enhances the opportunity for students. And I've already talked about some of the alternatives. I think that if this is something that you're interested in doing, that Teams is a very good solution. So, but I also don't want to suggest that it is the only solution or the best solution. I did want to mention, because if you're concerned about, whether and how students would communicate with each other, that we have done some case studies in tools similar to Teams, and that what we found is that with early instructor buy-in and some structure on how you expect students to work with each other in this online space, we have seen that among 17 students in one semester, they exchanged with each other over 5,000 messages. And the primary function of those messages appeared to be helping each other come out of ditches. So students who were struggling with assignments, struggling with materials, they were encouraged to help each other with no penalties for overstepping, no penalties for giving away answers that really should not have been given away. And this may or may not align with your philosophy on teaching, but one thing that we know about online students in particular, as opposed to face-to-face students or working in the classroom, is that sometimes it really does feel like it's them against the computer. And so giving students the opportunity to get that immediate feedback from their classmates can certainly take some of the burden off of you to deliver feedback, and also creates that classroom community that we're sure that you have established in your face-to-face courses already. So if you are going to be using Microsoft Teams or some other web conferencing platform, and you are going to be doing some kind of synchronous instruction, perhaps there are review sessions or just discussions, or maybe you're actually presenting new material during these sessions, you might want to consider some tips, some kind of classroom management strategies that have been helpful for others. So an opening script is really nice. Just opening remarks. You can talk about, asking students to keep their audio muted, for example, or how to ask questions, or whether or not you're going to be calling on students by name to facilitate discussion. That's something that I do when I teach online, is I actually let my students know in advance that I will be calling on them by name to answer questions instead of saying anyone. But I also give them the opportunity to say pass. Not I don't know, or I'm not familiar, but just say pass. It's kind of low stakes, and I don't want anybody to feel like they have to have the correct answer. I just am trying to keep the conversation going. And also, the very first session really should be a learner training opportunity. Get everybody acclimated to the tool, get everybody feeling good about using it. This is true for just about any engagement tool that you might be using in your course, including Voicethread or other tools, but it is especially helpful that very first time. Students should be able to join and just learn how to use the tool if it is going to be an essential part of what you're doing throughout the semester. It's also helpful to maybe take volunteers if you don't have teaching assistants or graduate assistants. Have students volunteer to field the chat for you or to interrupt on other students' behalf. There's almost always a volunteer in your cohort who would be willing to do something like that. And then also, sometimes it's nice to just let students know what to do if things go wrong. Encourage them not to panic. It's okay. Restarting a device or rejoining a meeting is a really great, I think it's called the 80% rule or the 70% rule. It's going to fix a lot of problems. You certainly are not responsible for being a tech support specialist for all the tools that you use, but there are a few things that you can do to safeguard for your students and also to get them feeling comfortable about coming to you with issues that they may have. The next section I'm going to focus on is really the feedback section. And I think that this is a common misstep that we see in online learning, simply because the classroom management piece of it is a little bit more complex, perhaps, than what we're used to when we're teaching face-to-face. We give students all of these ideas and materials, and we show them, we do demonstrations of how to do new things, and then we assess them on their performance. And while this feedback mechanism is perhaps a bit more difficult to achieve in a fully remote environment, it certainly is still essential. And so we want to encourage you to build in lots of opportunities for students to practice doing what you're asking them to do before they have to perform on that summative assessment at the end of the course, whether it's a project or a final exam or a paper or whatever it might be in your course. there are lots of good frameworks for providing feedback, and you may have a favorite that you like to use. Mine is just that it needs to be specific and timely. And so I'm going to talk through some of the feedback mechanisms or feedback systems that are in Blackboard and are available to you as you give feedback to your students on their work throughout the semester. So one thing that you may have already talked about is coming up with feedback guarantees and expectations that you share with your students. So I've pulled out some language from a couple of syllabi that I've seen for fully online courses that I wanted to share. The first one is your instructor will provide feedback and grades for assignments within 7 days of the date you submit it. Sometimes things happen. However, at times, unexpected circumstances may delay grading of occasional assignments. Your instructor will communicate to you a change in when you will receive grading feedback. I think it's important to include something like this for your own sake, but also for your students' sake. And it's less about accountability and more about alleviating anxiety. So when you're teaching face-to-face, or at least when I'm teaching face-to-face, I've noticed that I'll casually mention on a Tuesday afternoon, oh, I haven't gotten to that yet. You know, you'll probably get them by Thursday or something like that. And you're probably all judging me right now, like you should really be better about that. But in an online course, I don't always have that opportunity to just kind of squeeze that in. And so having a policy like this lets students know that it could take up to 7 days. And so if they're waiting on a grade, it's not that they've already received it and they can't find it, or that you've overlooked their submission, or that everybody's off doing something and they don't know what they're supposed to be doing because they've missed an important piece of communication. And so just including this can help alleviate a lot of that anxiety that online students can sometimes experience because they aren't seeing your faces 2 or 3 times a week and hearing that, you know, casual mention of an assignment that everybody has already turned in. Another good reminder is that you are taking the time to provide feedback to students. And so students should know that they should be expecting feedback. I think that sometimes, especially in online courses, well, maybe only in online courses, because if you're giving feedback in your face-to-face courses, you're probably handing it directly to students, right? But sometimes students can't find their feedback on Blackboard or wherever you've left it. And I'll talk a little bit about that later at the end of the session, but just letting students know in advance that, yeah, I'll be giving you feedback. I'm going to expect you to take a look at it and do something with it. That can be helpful too. Now, as far as types of feedback go, I like to think about it in this sort of makeshift taxonomy where you are not going to be able, well, depending on your course structure, you are not going to be able to give individualized feedback on every single thing that students do in your course. And that is okay. That is not the expectation. That doesn't mean that's what good remote teaching is. And so I like to do a balance of generalized feedback and actually generalized feedback as you teach multiple versions and iterations of your online courses. Those could just be built directly into your assignments. And then feedback to a specific assignment or cohort. And those can be really helpful if you have students working in a discussion board, for example, and maybe you have 40 students or 60 students. You're obviously not going to be able to contribute in a way that you could if you were walking around a classroom and kind of chiming into smaller discussion groups. But maybe you could, for example, create a Wordle from all of your students' responses. A Wordle is a word cloud, so think about those images that you see online where there are big words and smaller words and they're all kind of related by theme. And creating one of those from your students' discussion boards and then sending that out at the end of a discussion forum when it closes can be a really good way of helping students visualize what was discussed, what themes emerged, what is on everyone's mind. And it takes pressure off of you to respond very specifically, but it also shows that you are paying attention, that you are reading through everything. And I can tell you that when I very first started teaching online, I was so green, and I thought that what I was supposed to do was to go into all of these discussion boards and just participate everywhere and go to town and comment on everything. And actually what I found is that it seemed that my students would just stop commenting after I participated. Like, oh, she's spoken, you know, that topic is done now, let's move on. And I really didn't want that. So the second semester I taught, I tried to use different types of language and always end my statements with a question to follow up, but it didn't seem to make any difference. So conventional wisdom is that you should be posting in discussion boards and things like that, but it didn't work for me specifically, but this does. So once a week, I might send out a video that I've customized for a particular cohort, or the Wordle that I already explained, and just to kind of bring closure to that activity. And then of course there's feedback that is specific to each individual student that you have. And I think that it is important that you do this for every single student in a really strong way, at least once per semester during your course. And I'm going to walk through some mechanisms on how you might do that. There are lots of tools that you can use. Jody is going to provide this PowerPoint to you, and I have linked in the OIT Toolbox page, which will help you make decisions about which assignment and feedback mechanisms are most appropriate for you and for what you want to accomplish in fall. I'm not going to go through that, but I would encourage you to check that out. One tool that you have available to you in Blackboard is a basic assignments tool, or Turnitin. And the advantage here is that these are really good if students are submitting papers. So any kind of paper that's going to be uploaded, a Word document or a PDF, something that you would normally just collect from your students, you can actually use the assignments tool or the Turnitin tools that are built into Blackboard as a feedback mechanism. I will say that Turnitin has more robust feedback options, including creating sets of feedback that you can use over and over again. And these do not need to be related to grammar and writing mechanics. You can build sets of feedback for any topic that you might be teaching. And so as you are grading assignments, if you start to notice some common issues, you can create a blur. I don't know what these are called actually, like head in the game, highlight reel, beat the buzzer, I guess just comments. I would call them comments, and you can drag and drop those into your students' assignments, which can give them specific feedback, but also it's more timely because you don't have to write out the same thing over and over again. And so this is a really great way to annotate and provide feedback in line on students' work. And then you also have the option to provide a little bit of audio feedback where you would actually record your voice and give that to students. And whether you choose to do this or not, I think it's important to be aware that it's an option for a couple of reasons. If you are teaching a course in fall that is gigantic, students are probably mostly going to communicate with you in writing. And sometimes it can be really hard to convey tone in writing, especially if students aren't hearing your voice and seeing your beautiful faces in the front of the classroom a few times a week and knowing how you sound. And this is especially true if you're from a field like I'm from, where no news is good news. And so we often don't provide a lot of positive feedback. Typically, it's only things that you need to do to improve. And that's great from an efficiency standpoint and also a timeliness standpoint. But it can make students maybe misinterpret your feedback or feel like their work was worse than it actually is. And so anyway, the gist of this is that you may want to consider giving different modes of individualized feedback to your students when and if you can, just so they can hear your voices and know how you sound when you're talking to them. It's also really great to hear your professor say your name at some point. I find that to be really powerful and to make a difference when I'm teaching fully remote. The next feedback mechanism that I'm going to discuss is the Blackboard Quiz option. And I've included this as a feedback mechanism. It can be used as a summative assessment. that's fine. And I'm sure you can imagine how that would be done. But it also can be used as automated formative assessment so that students can conduct self-checks. So when you create a question in Blackboard, you actually have the option to build in specific feedback for each of the options that you include so that students can go through without you and practice whatever it is that you are asking them to practice and get some feedback specific to how they performed. It does take time to set up in advance, but if you have a larger class and you know that you won't be able to manually grade as many assignments as you would like, then this can be a really good way of providing that feedback to students without having to, well, I guess putting it on autopilot, right? It's kind of a turnkey. And that's just something that that lots of people do. And so how this might function in your course is that you create maybe a 10 or 15 question quiz for each unit or each week or each module, and then you require students to get a perfect score on it. So make them continue to attempt these questions until they've mastered the material. And I mentioned Blackboard quizzes because this is built into our learning management system, but I also want to mention that there are some really nice activities that are already available online, like through Quizlet, for example. And if you're using publisher materials from your textbook, it is highly likely that there are already some Quizlet decks that have been created for your textbook that you can easily embed into your courses as flashcards or as different kinds of games. That's something to keep in mind as well, especially if you're teaching a larger course. Teams for Education does have some LMS-like qualities with it. And I would say that for the most part, especially if you're new to remote teaching, you may want to keep everything that you're doing in Blackboard as far as assignments and grading goes. But if you are working with graduate students in particular, or even upperclassmen who are working on very specific long-term projects, and you want to assume the role more of a mentor to these students rather than a teacher, although teachers are mentors and vice versa, then working in Microsoft Teams and using the shared document features and collaborative editing features might be a really good way to maintain a connection with your mentees over the course of the semester. And it's something that is more easily accomplished than it could be in Blackboard. And so you would be using OneDrive essentially in combination with Teams. That is something that we could help you set up, or OIT could help you set up. And the idea is that it would be a space for you to provide feedback and to mentor your students without having to worry about grades and points attached to things. So that's something to consider as well. Also, I mentioned earlier a case study about using Teams for communication in which students were encouraged to help each other. And I just wanted to kind of give you a visual of what that might look like. If you notice on the left-hand navigation menu or the sidebar under algebra, it says homework help. So homework help is just a channel that has been created in a team. And it could be a place where you field questions, but it also could be a place where your students field questions for each other. And we've seen this work really well if you can build it into the classroom culture early on in the semester and encourage use of this space. It can be something really powerful. I've experienced this in my own courses. And in fact, just this summer I was teaching, and I think I made a mistake or something like that. And a student asked the question, you know, I'm not really clear what this is. And another student chimed in and was so nice and said, you know what, I bet Audra's going to get to that on Tuesday when she sends out her weekly announcements. So let's just wait. And I thought that was so wonderful of that student to kind of anticipate something that I probably should have taken care of already, but I'm human and my teaching practice is not perfect. So that would be a really great opportunity. Robin asks, where is this? Robin, I'm assuming that you mean the screenshot that I'm showing of the algebra. This is an example of a team that you could create for your course. So instead of saying out,
I don't know, my screen's not showing it's showing it. So I must have just missed it. That's okay though. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, you know what? We're going to make these slides available to you afterwards. And the slide topic just says Teams for Education. And you may have, can you see anything at all on your screen by any chance?
Yes, I have your Microsoft Teams up and just a picture of you with a, but it's really small. So I don't know. I don't know if I hit a wrong button. I'll have to just go back. I'm sorry to.
Oh, no, it's okay. Sometimes these things kind of happen in Teams. And so we'll make sure that you get the information that you need, I promise. Moving on, I did want to mention Voicethread because Voicethread is a really great way. It's a great alternative to host an asynchronous conversation that is going to most closely approach the experience of having a synchronous conversation among you and your students. And if you're not familiar with Voicethread, I'll just give you a kind of an overview. You have an image in the middle of a screen, and then your students and you can actually annotate and build a conversation, not at the same time, but maybe over the course of a week using video, audio, or text. And you can also leave private messages to students. So this is a really great way of facilitating a conversation that does not happen all at the same time when the focal point is something that may be more visually compelling. And so we have an image here of American food, and so this is visually compelling. It's an alternative to a discussion board, yes, but also there are some audiovisual elements that, depending on the assignment, could enhance the experience for students. And so if you are interested in Voicethread and maybe taking your discussion boards up a notch, or if you think that you have students do things like this, perhaps if you're teaching a language course, for example, and you want to assess student physiology when they pronounce certain words, but you don't want to do that or you can't do that synchronously because of other issues, this would be a really good platform to do so. And you can schedule an appointment with OIT and they can run you through the bells and whistles on how to set that up. And I did mention at the very beginning of the session, and I'm going to go through it right now, that no matter what feedback mechanism you decide to use, I certainly recommend that you invest some time early on and perhaps create an assignment using that mechanism, that assignment tool, for example, just to get students trained on how to use it, number one, and also trained on where to find the feedback. And this also might require you to adjust some settings. I will warn you right now that Blackboard's default for quizzes, for example, is that students only get to see their score per question. What they don't get to see is all the answers that were possible. They don't see any of the correct answers that they selected, and they also don't see what they submitted by default. They also aren't going to see that customized feedback that you might build in. So you'll want to make sure that you adjust those settings correctly. This is a security issue, really. Well, it's not a security issue, but it's really to protect academic integrity and to make sure that students aren't building up quiz banks. But you'll want to make sure that you check the settings and get them most appropriate for you. Along that same vein, you'll want to make sure that students know what types of feedback that you've sent to them and how they can find it. So for example, these are all of the output options for Turnitin. So students can actually check the plagiarism checker if you've turned that on using the grade mark view. And they can also look at, if you look in the bottom left corner, you'll be able to see, and your students will be able to see these little like talking icons, and they should know that these are comments that you've typed to them. You can also type in the margins. They can play a voice comment. You could have left a generalized text comment. The idea is that students should be able to find everything and know what types of feedback that you've left for them, because it burns. And I'll tell you from experience, it burns when you've been leaving robust feedback and, you know, kind of pouring your heart into your feedback, and students don't know it exists. And because they don't know it exists, they don't know to ask for it. So learn from my mistakes and make sure that, that students know how to do that. Do the voice comments have speech to text captions? So they do not, but you could certainly include a in the text comment below, you can include a transcript there. And so that is actually all that I have to present to you today. I have some time for questions, and Meg and Jody, and I'm sure some of you have experiences that you can share also. So I guess I would, at this point, open up the session to specific questions.
Is the feedback section just on Blackboard, or is that a Teams feature?
The only Teams feature that I recommended would be the collaborative aspect of working on documents together. There are some other features that Microsoft Teams has built into it as a learning management system type thing. However, I am reluctant to recommend those unless you have a specific purpose for them, because they do not talk to Blackboard. And I know that that's an important aspect for instructors who are trying to maintain an up-to-date gradebook.
We also have somebody coming over from OIT on Thursday to talk about MS Teams in the teaching and learning environment and how to use it, or what features you can use as an LMS. So there'll be a lot more detail on that on Thursday.
All right, well, I think your facilitators do have my email address in case anybody did have a follow-up question for me. But I think at this point I can hand things back over to them, if that's okay.
Thank you, Audra. And we will post the slides in this meeting chat. So check back in. There'll be a PDF available for you soon. And remember to check back in tomorrow at 10 o'clock and again at 1 o'clock for 2 more sessions. I think we have creating lectures and a Panopto presentation, if I'm not mistaken. And there's more throughout the week. So thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Audra. And hopefully we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.